very warm welcome to Insight. I am Amandra Bhatt. Today we talk about the outcome of the recently concluded BRICS summit. The leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa have announced the establishment of a development bank which will challenge the influence of existing global financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. The new development bank will be based in Shanghai and it will begin with an initial capital of $50 billion. A contingency fund of $100 billion has also been put in place. India will name the first president of this bank. But what are the challenges and the risks that this institution is faced with? And do these countries have enough in common to be able to sustain such a multilateral institution? And does it give them a greater voice, political voice in the global arena? We discuss in today's Insight. And to discuss the same, we are joined in our studios by three distinguished guests. Please welcome Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi. He is a senior fellow with Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Chaturvedi. Sitting next to him is Mr. Satish Mishra. He is a senior journalist. Welcome to Insight, Mr. Mishra. We are also joined by Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. He is a former ambassador. He is also someone who has been credited with shaping the negotiations for the first ever BRICS summit. Welcome to Insight, sir. Mr. Mishra, I'd like to begin with you. After intense negotiations that we believe lasted till the 11th hour, finally this announcement has been made, the setting up of a BRICS bank which will be led by these 5 countries. How do you look at this development?
First of all, the setting of this bank, the called New Development Bank, has been in the pipeline for almost over 2 years.
Right.
Negotiations have been going on, how it has to be set up, where it has to be set up, and give and take was going on. Various institutions were involved in it. India has played a very important, significant role in shaping up the agenda of the bank. I know for sure the Ministry of External Affairs and various other institutions, including some think tanks of India, were involved in this process. Now, the time has come that at this summit in South Africa, in Brazil, this announcement has finally been made. Now, it was need of the hour that BRICS, which constitutes of the countries that you mentioned, has almost over 40% of the world population.
Right.
And it has almost 18% of the global trade. Now, these countries have been, at the mercy of the institutions which were created after the Second World War, the World Bank and the IMF. And if you go deep into it, they have been dictating their policies. So it was rightly felt that there has to be an institution, financial institution, where decisions are taken by these countries, and it is not only meant for these countries.
Okay.
Its operations can help Africa, the Latin American countries,
right,
and those who are in the need of financial aid, advice and strategies.
Right. So this bank is not only going to look after the developmental needs of member countries, but also other developing emerging economies. Ambassador Kumar, I would like to understand from you, although Mr. Mishra did touch upon it, why the need for such a bank was felt. Of course, this was a long-standing grouse of developing economies these global financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank have been they've had a discriminatory attitude against these economies. The agenda and so on, everything was dominated by the rich G7 countries. But why what's the rationale behind setting up such a bank?
Well, I think one is that I would really perhaps not use the word biased against us, but I think the general complaint of the developing countries, particularly member countries of BRICS, has been that these institutions are actually somewhat out of touch with the reality of time. In fact, this Fortaleza declaration, which has been issued yesterday, it actually uses a fairly strong language against the IMF, because there is already a commitment at the G20 level that there should be democratization of these banks, the IMF as well as the World Bank, to revise the quota that each member country has, because if you have more quota allocation, then you are in a position to be more decisively involved in the decisions of the bank. So actually they are delaying on that. In fact, the language of the declaration actually is fairly strong, that there is some kind of a stalling of the reform process. So in one way it's a message that you can say which has taken place. The other thing, of course, is that in one way the BRICS countries, they represent a different outlook than the G7, as you mentioned. One, of course, is that these institutions, they themselves have admitted, and G20's main conclusion, including that of these banks themselves, is that they are not prepared for the 2008 financial crisis. They were inadequate capacity to actually handle that. So in fact, the G20, what they did was to strengthen these banks to actually handle the crisis properly. So the outlook actually of the BRICS countries, as represented in this particular bank, is that the priorities actually have to be at the infrastructure and sustainable development, and perhaps running it themselves. As I said, a different orientation altogether, because in fact, if you remember, the World Bank was initially financing the Narmada Dam project. But they withdrew the funding because of, a lot of NGOs started complaining about environment and so on and so forth, whereas actually it was a mistake. But the point is that the bank was guided more by NGO, civil society opinion, rather than the opinion or the decision of the bank itself and what the government of India was saying. So what you find now is that this particular bank is outside the Bretton Woods system, and therefore it's a very different outlook towards the development of the political economy of the world, so to say. And here it is not just the bank itself, but it represents the commitment of the BRICS countries towards the polycentric world order. So actually it's all part of that larger let's say ambition and aspiration of the BRICS countries, and they are not alone in that. That's why you find a lot of developing countries are supportive of this particular approach.
Okay, so it has to do with not just the stringent conditions that the World Bank and IMF have been attaching to their lending to developing countries, the languishing reforms that you talked about, but do you also think it has to do with the current geopolitical scenario? Although this idea was mooted in 2012, but the fact that Russia has been facing sanctions and the IMF has decided to bail out Ukraine, do you think it has to do with it?
Well, I think very clearly, because as I said, as I said, the commitment is the polycentric world order. This is what you find the declaration. All declarations said that. So first of all, is that you in a way are able to whittle away at the disproportionate authority and influence the G7 countries exercise on world affairs. So that is clearly the case. Now, I would not link it with the sanctions against Russia or anything like that. I think it's simply that the attempts being made by the developing countries to change the orientation of the activities and the thinking of the World Bank and the IMF, I think in a way it embodies that aspiration. And I think given the fact that these are fairly important countries, 25% the global GDP is the net worth, so to say, of the BRICS. But if you take in the purchasing power parity basis, it can be even as close to 30% of the GDP. So therefore, this is considerable economic heft that these countries have, and therefore they are now in a position to make a difference.
Okay, Dr. Chaturvedi, but the BRICS countries overcame great challenges to announce this bank, but what remains to be seen, of course, is the implementation. But do you think it can actually pose a challenge to the World Bank and the IMF?
I think they should, because if you go deeper into the need realization of it, I think BRICS have this alternate narrative, which is, I think, far more important than the institution and the kind of ideas that we have in terms of its operational dimension of it. And that alternative narrative comes from the deep-rooted approach that most of the BRICS countries remove for a while, but then otherwise you find that all of them have pursued policies which are pretty close to the idea of a structuralist approach in an economy, where you do not bother much about the larger macroeconomic disequilibrium in the system, and you are far away from what is called as Washington consensus, which is based on conditionalities. So that alternative has to be forcefully articulated by the BRICS countries when you are thinking of establishing an institution like the BRICS Bank. So from that standpoint, it's extremely important how they visualize, and as Chinese Premier has already indicated, Argentina would be the first case to get qualified for a support. I think it's extremely important for us to see that whoever takes over as head of the institution, but the larger narrative brings out what Raul Prebisch and others stood for, and which is the perspective from the South. So how the perspective from South, and mind it that this would be the first financial institution from the South.
Okay.
After all this while, I mean,
right.
I would not count the regional funds which came up like the ASEAN Development Fund and others, but a true Southern institution. And South has been very weak on this wicket in terms of contributing establishment of the institutions. So that, I think, is the first contribution. So what is our philosophical commitment? What is our economic rationale? What theory would govern it is extremely important for us to see that this structuralist architecture comes up in the working. And then we overcome the kind of challenges that are there before the bank.
Right. Ambassador Kumar, I'll come to you in just a bit. We have to take a break in the program. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
The existing global
Welcome back to Insight. We are talking about the outcome of the recently concluded BRICS summit. Ambassador Kumar, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I agree with what my co-panelist has said. I actually wanted to make one broader point, that the BRICS are not in the business actually of subverting or overthrowing the existing order. All these BRIC economies are very closely intermeshed with the global economy, including the economies of the developed countries. In fact, what they are saying actually is that we want to modify the global order, because actually the global order, what is happening in the current current situation really is that the global order is actually shaky. Whether as the Prime Minister said before his departure, and he said at the BRICS summit itself in his interventions, that the instability, the jar of instability is spreading across borders. So that is one issue. The second issue, the global financial crisis is not over yet, and they all talk about quite significant challenges to it. So the fact that the formal structures of the global management are actually somewhat out of date with the current reality, therefore they need to be modified. Because all of us, all the BRICS countries, they commit themselves to the United Nations, to the World Bank, the IMF, everything. All that they're saying, they need to be modified, because only if they're modified, they become relevant to the current reality. And therefore, what the BRICS Bank actually is the first example of that is, or the BRICS as a grouping actually, that you are actually more like a kind of a group within the larger order of things, so to say, where you are actually constantly trying to change the narrative, the agenda, the discussion, the broader outlook of the other countries about as to how the global challenges are to be addressed currently. So actually it's more a process. It certainly reflects the reality of the shifting balance of power, no doubt. But more than that, it is that you want to change the existing order somewhat, so that, as I said, that it is better capable of handling our challenges that we face today.
Okay, so whether or not these countries will be able to break any new ground or forge any new initiatives to change the existing world order, that remains to be seen. You wanted to come in here, Dr. Chaturvedi?
Yes, exactly, because I slightly disagree with Mr. Kumar on this point. It's not question of changing or bringing in reality in the global order. Here the idea is slightly different. Idea is that the developed countries, particularly the custodians of World Bank and IMF, have not allowed the maneuvering space to developing countries in terms of coping up with the kind of domestic challenges they have. And as a result, whenever they required liquidity, World Bank and IMF have been giving sort of dictates to the countries which are approaching them for funds. And as a result, all the dictates that are issued by these multilateral institutions, they have been to the interest of the custodians of these institutions.
Right.
And as a result, EU and US have been trying to ensure their own interests. So I disagree with the fact that it would bring in realism. It's not realism. It would shake up the system and would bring in alternative approach. And the alternative approach is emanating from the new power that the South has. So it's a major overhaul. And second point, which is I think far more important, is that the conditionality-free loans that the countries would get.
Right.
And there I again re-emphasize the point which I made earlier, that it would be free from conditionalities.
Okay.
Because the kind of economic rationale these countries bring on table is largely what Prebisk articulated in terms of macroeconomic variables. Even if they are in disequilibrium, economic growth is possible. And that's the narrative which South brings in.
Okay.
So it's not just marginal adjustment to bring in realism.
Okay,
it's
so
an
a
overhaul.
paradigm shift, you're saying. Mr. Mishra, would you agree with Dr. Chaturvedi? Do you think these economies or the BRICS Development Bank can pose a challenge to IMF and World Bank?
The reality lies somewhere in between. The fact of the matter is that the global order which came into existence after the Second World War, IMF and World Bank Bretton Woods agreements. See, fact of the matter is that times are changing, realities are changing on ground, and those who have been controlling the levers of power are themselves are not that important that they used to be at the time of after the Second World War. Now, the British economy or the French economy are not that important anymore. China and India, Russia and Brazil, and to some lesser extent South Africa, have the economic emerging powers.
Right.
So, the setting of the BRICS Bank is one step in that direction. And much more needs to come.
Okay.
Because after all, I mean, imagine, though China and India are the emerging economies and China is economy number 1, India is almost economy number 3.
Right.
But challenges of poverty and the poor is far more challenging.
Right.
Imagine almost India and China, poverty is much more than the economy
Absolutely.
that we have. We have to. These poorer sections have to be looked after. They are far more important and sensitive to or challenges to the stability of the world order. If they are not addressed, then they can be far more potential threats to stability.
But Mr. Mishra, critics would say that the BRICS economies too have somewhat lost their sheen. You know, they've slowed down. When this acronym was first coined in 2001, they were all set to become the richest economies of the world by 2050. Do you think they still have the same potential?
The fact of the matter is that there has been a global slowdown. But whether India has had economic growth of say less than 5%, but far more than the European economies or the American or the US economy.
Right.
I mean, China has slowed down, but To what extent? Once the global economy starts repicking, then Indian economy will also grow.
Okay.
Again to 6%, 7%, 8%, and I would not be surprised in next decade or so, Indian economy may be in double digits. Or the Chinese economy will be once again in double digits.
Right.
That is not, I mean, after all, the economic growth has to be seen in the global context. There may be critics. The sheen may have been lost, but the pace hasn't been lost.
All right. So the pace hasn't been lost. Ambassador Kumar, what do you think?
Well, actually, I only want to make one point that I think it's too bold to say that we are going to shake up the global order. It's not in our capacity, number one. Number two, as it is, we are all, as I mentioned, we are so much closely intermeshed with the global economy, including the economy of the developed countries.
Right.
That it's impossible we can do that and not be affected by it. I mean, it's not like the Soviet bloc, which actually was economically self-sufficient and militarily self-sufficient, that they could take on the rest of the world, and even they couldn't do that. So I think basically what it means is that but through this process, you're actually strengthening your collective capacity to influence the global agenda. And that is already happening. The G20 agenda is very largely shaped by the BRICS. In fact, if you remember the Los Cabos summit, which took place last year in Mexico, the G20, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh actually said that it is because of the BRICS intervention that the Euro was saved, because the British wanted to get out the Eurozone. The Germans said we couldn't care, until it was brought home to all of them that, I mean, you can't just get away if there is a crisis brewing, even in one part of the world, that others will be unaffected by that. So I think that is a larger issue. And in that sense, perhaps, it is not that we are going back to recorrect or correct the imbalance of the Second World War, because the times really have changed. The other thing, of course, is that in terms of GDP and all that is fine. I would actually say that we place too much of emphasis on Jim O'Neill's his acronym that he coined. I think I would rather say it is not so much Jim O'Neill, it is President Putin who actually conceived this idea as a geostrategic construct.
Okay.
And therefore, and why is it? Because these countries are by themselves very important, irrespective of what rate of growth they have. And if some other country is, let's say, having a higher rate of growth, doesn't mean that they actually automatically become part of this particular grouping. No, because when you think of a country, it is not just the rate of growth, but its overall, international profile and capacity. So I think that is why it's very important, this particular grouping. And the bank, in a way,
but again, many would say they don't have anything else in common other than the fact that they are growing at a certain rate.
No, I think as we have already mentioned that 45% of the share of the global economic growth was contributed to the BRICS countries. I mean, that's a big number. 53% of the FDI, the global FDI were actually received by the BRICS countries. That's a big number. 46% of the global population is a big number. And there's 25 or 30% of the GDP in purchasing power parity terms is a big number. And amongst themselves, it's about 922% during the last decade that the intra-BRIC trade has grown. So you can see that it actually has developed a dynamic of its own. And this dynamic actually is now being put to a strategic purpose. And this is the strategic purpose that we've been discussing here.
Okay, so it's more than just an acronym, more than just an aspiration now.
Well, actually, no, it's a reality. It's a hard reality of global politics today.
All right. Well, with that, we take yet another break in the program. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Insight. We are talking about the outcome of the BRICS summit with the announcement of the new development bank and the challenges that it is faced with. Dr. Chaturvedi, I'll continue with you. Now, if we look at, if we take a reality check of sorts, in this, in terms of, being an actual challenge to existing global financial institutions, a sum of $50 billion, it seems really modest when compared to the World Bank, where it is above $200 billion. Similarly, if we look at the reserve currency, the IMF, we are told, can muster up to $1 trillion in case of emergencies. Where will it stand then?
Yeah, no, I think we should see this as Mr. Mishra very rightly said. It's a sort of expression of intent. It's a very small step. I agree with you that with 50 billion you can't really change the global order in a very major way. Similarly, a CRA of 100 billion is not enough. But then definitely what it symbolizes is commitment of South to bail out their own members. It can happen with any of their own members when it happens. The kind of importance that the short-term FDI has got in economies, you have to have CRA arrangements of some magnitude. We should not forget, as Ambassador rightly mentioned, in terms of BRICS countries bailing out part of the countries which were affected, the PICs and the European crisis. So we did extend support to that. So an alternative is emerging, and that alternative signifies our intent to bring in, as I said earlier, alternate narrative in terms of how we look at the global order and how it should look like. So here is an opportunity where we are contributing in a major way to bring a larger change. Today it is 50. China was very keen that it should be settled at 100. But it was India's insistence, and some of us who were very closely watching the deliberations at the working group level are very clear about the fact that the idea of having equal shares by all of them was the bottom line.
Right.
And this we could achieve. So dominance of one single power at the cost of the larger money block that we could have got with this, we have avoided. So there was a trade-off. Definitely we can't expect South Africa to come out with $20 billion.
Right.
So as a result, we had to compromise on a lower denominator, and that's where we have settled. But this largely signifies the intention. The intention to correct the system, and that's where I think we should look at.
But when it comes to the contingency fund, the bulk of it is going to come from China, to something to the tune of $41 billion, we're told.
Yes.
There are concerns that more funds could mean more influence.
Yeah, but then there we have given concession to South Africa, which is sparing only $5 billion, and rest of them are contributing something like $18 billion. So 41, 18 and 5, that's the kind of ratio we have worked out. And this CRO of 100 billion is a very significant contribution, because the last 5 years Argentina was fighting battle against the hedge funds from US in US, and now they have lost out. So they are looking for some maneuvering space, somebody to support them. And US has completely backed out.
Right.
The reasons are largely related to NAFTA and the problems that they are facing in their own regional trade equilibrium. But then this alternative is coming up.
Okay.
And that's where we are freeing up the countries from